Baraga County, Michigan, November 1913. Lake Superior wind cuts through the timber like a blade, driving snow sideways across Herman Hunka's homestead. While his neighbors stacked their firewood outside under tarps, this Finnish immigrant had spent months building what they called a skirt, a continuous lean-to shed wrapped all the way around his 17 by 22-foot cabin. They called it wasteful. They called it ugly as a barn. Most homesteaders threw up quick wood piles in 2 days and considered the job done. Herman built a covered gallery that took him 3 weeks, storing 8 to 12 cords under a solid roof with proper ventilation. His neighbors laughed until the Great Lakes storm hit without warning. 60 to 80 mile per hour winds, blinding snow, temperatures plunging to 10 below. Their exposed wood piles froze into solid blocks, tarps became ice sheets, and kindling turned too wet to light. But Herman, he opened a plank door in his gallery, pulled out split wood that rang when it hit the jam, and his fire caught on the first match. What did this immigrant understand about wind, moisture, and fuel storage that everyone else dismissed as excessive until their stoves went cold and has stayed burning through the longest storm in Great Lakes history? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The wind off Lake Superior carried more than cold that November night in 1913. It carried the kind of wet that turns dry wood slick and makes fires die. Herman Hunka could hear it building from inside his 17 by 22-foot log cabin, the sound changing from whistle to howl as gusts found the gaps between the trees. Snow didn't fall so much as a tack, driving sideways like buckshot against anything foolish enough to stand in the open. 300 yards down the timber trail, Bert Carlson's stove sputtered and went dark. The split oak he'd stacked against his cabin wall 2 weeks earlier had looked bone dry under the October sun, but tonight that same wood wore a glaze of ice thick as window glass. Each piece he fed the firebox hissed and steamed, filling his cabin with smoke instead of heat. His wife wrapped the children in every quilt they owned, while Bert cursed and struck match after match, watching them die against wood that refused to catch. Herman heard none of this commotion, focused instead on the simple task of keeping his own fire fed. He stepped into the covered gallery that wrapped around his cabin like a continuous lean-to shed, the structure his neighbors had spent months mocking as wasteful and ugly. The wind that hammered Bert's exposed woodpile couldn't reach this covered space. Herman's split birch and maple lay stacked on poles 18 inches off the ground, sorted by size, dry as tinder. When he pulled a piece from the pile, it rang against the door jamb with the clear note of seasoned hardwood. Back at his firebox, the wood caught on the first match and burned clean. No smoke, no hiss of moisture-fighting flame. The gallery that saved his fuel that night had taken Herman 3 weeks to build the previous summer, time his neighbors considered proof of foreign foolishness. Most homesteaders threw together outdoor wood piles in a day or two, split the rounds, stack them against the cabin wall, throw a tarp over the top, and call the job finished. Quick, cheap, and good enough for most winters in the Great Lakes timber country. Herman's method looked like madness by comparison. Posts set 4 to 6 feet out from every wall of his cabin, ledger boards notched into the log walls, lean-to rafters creating a continuous shed roof that sloped away from the house on all sides. He'd skinned the outer walls with rough-sawn planks, leaving strategic vents near the eaves so damp air could escape, but wind and snow couldn't drive in. The mockery had started the moment he began digging post holes that July. Bert Carlson had been the loudest critic, calling the project a skirt that made Herman's place look like a half-finished barn. Other neighbors wondered aloud why any sane man would waste good lumber building a shed around his own house when a simple tarp could do the same job for a tenth the cost. The local fire warden had stopped by twice, worried about stacking combustible materials so close to a dwelling, though Herman's design included stone-lined fire breaks and proper clearances that satisfied even official concerns. Through August and into September, Herman had ignored the commentary and focused on the work. The gallery's roof pitched at a modest 4 to 12 slope, steep enough to shed wet snow, but shallow enough to keep lumber costs reasonable. The outer walls rose 7 feet high, creating a covered workspace that stayed dry even when storms drove rain horizontally across the clearing. Inside this protected ring, Herman organized his winter supplies like a well-planned warehouse. Split firewood stacked on rails to keep it off the damp ground. Hay baled and stored in bays away from any spark risk. Tools hung on pegs where snow couldn't bury them. By October, when the first serious cold arrived, Herman's gallery held 8 cords of split hardwood, enough fuel to carry his family through the longest Upper Peninsula winter. His neighbors' quick piles held similar quantities, but theirs sat exposed to every weather change that rolled off the big lake. When November brought the first freezing rains, Herman's wood stayed as dry as the day he'd split it. His neighbors' piles developed ice shells that turned each morning's fire starting into a frustrating battle between frozen fuel and urgent need for heat. The physics of Herman's success were simple enough for any homesteader to understand, though few had bothered to think through the implications. Wind was the enemy of both warmth and dry storage. Stop the wind, and a heating stove could work as designed. The gallery forced moving air to change direction, hit obstacles, and slow down before reaching either the cabin walls or the stored fuel. What looked like wasteful construction was actually a windbreak system built from lumber instead of living trees, engineered to protect both structure and supplies through the kind of weather that killed the unprepared. The storm that validated Herman's design arrived without the courtesy of gradual warning. The Great Lakes weather system that meteorologists would later document as producing sustained hurricane-force winds and blinding snow conditions hit the timber country like a fist. Temperatures that had hovered near freezing through early November plunged to 10 below zero in a single night. Winds that normally topped out at 20 or 30 miles per hour sustained themselves at 60 to 80 miles per hour across open water, driving snow so hard that visibility dropped to arm's length. In cabins throughout the district, exposed wood piles became monuments to the folly of quick solutions. Fuel that had seemed adequately protected under tarps and lean-to roofs froze into solid masses that axes could barely separate. Kindling turned to ice. Fire starting became an ordeal that consumed matches and patience, while producing more smoke than heat. Some families abandoned their main stoves entirely, huddling around kitchen ranges that burned better in the protected environment of interior walls. Herman's gallery absorbed the storm's full fury without compromising the resources it protected. Snow piled 3 feet deep against the outer walls, but the covered interior space remained accessible and dry. Wind that would have scattered loose fuel and driven moisture into every gap found itself blocked by walls and baffled by the shed roof design. The fuel Herman had stacked in July burned as cleanly in November's worst weather as it had during the calm days of autumn testing. When the storm finally broke after 3 days of sustained assault, Herman's chimney had never stopped smoking. His cabin had stayed warm enough for normal work and sleep. His fuel supply had proven itself capable of lasting through whatever winter could deliver. The same neighbors who had mocked his skirt now asked quiet questions about post spacing and rafter pitch, no longer laughing at foreign ideas that had kept one family comfortable while others shivered and struggled through the longest nights of their lives. The idea for the gallery had come to Herman during his second winter on the homestead, back in 1897, when he'd watched good firewood turn worthless under a succession of freezing rains that coated everything in glass-thick ice. He'd homesteaded the Barriga County timber claim the previous year, built his 17 by 22-foot cabin with proper Scandinavian dovetail notches, and thought himself prepared for whatever the Great Lakes country could deliver. That second winter taught him the difference between adequate and smart. Herman had grown up in Finland, where men built once and built to last, because mistakes froze families to death. The Upper Peninsula timber country felt familiar in its cold and remoteness, but the weather patterns off Lake Superior carried a wet persistence that Northern Europe had trained him to respect. When spring thaw revealed half his fuel pile rotted from moisture that had worked its way past every tarp and lean-to roof he'd tried, Herman began planning a solution that would control both wind and water before they reached his stored supplies. The conventional wisdom among Great Lakes homesteaders was simple and economical. Stack your wood outside, cover the top, and trust that most winters wouldn't be wet enough to ruin properly seasoned fuel. Bert Carlson had been preaching this gospel since the early 80s, when he'd first cleared his claim and learned to heat with the abundant hardwood that grew on every quarter section. Throw a good tarp over your woodpile, Bert would tell newcomers, weight it down with stones, and you'll have dry fuel through any normal winter. The method worked often enough to seem proven, and it required no lumber, no construction time, and no investment beyond rope and canvas. Town officials in the scattered settlements along the lake shore had their own concerns about fuel storage. Most of them focused on preventing the cabin fires that regularly claimed lives and property. Stacking combustible materials against dwelling walls violated the common sense that had developed around countless chimney fires and overheated stovepipes. The fire warden who visited Herman's place during the planning stages worried aloud about putting hay and split wood so close to living quarters, though he admitted that proper clearances and stone fire breaks might address the worst risks. Herman's design defied both conventional economy and official caution, but it answered the problems he'd observed through 3 seasons of homestead life. Wind was the destroyer of both warmth and dry storage, stopped the wind, and both heating and fuel preservation became manageable tasks. His gallery would create a buffered envelope around the entire cabin, breaking the airflow that drove moisture into wood piles and sucked heat from log walls. Construction began in July of 1898, when Herman could work long days and count on dry weather for lumber handling. He started with posts, hand-augured holes 18 inches deep, set 4 to 6 feet out from each cabin wall, packed with fieldstone for stability. The spacing had to accommodate standard lumber lengths while creating enough interior space for wood stacking and daily movement. Posts every 8 feet provided adequate support for the roof load while leaving manageable bays for organizing different materials. The ledger board system proved more complex than Herman had anticipated. Notching horizontal support beams into the existing log walls required careful measurement and sharp tools, since any gaps would leak both air and water. He chose to support each ledger with both wall notches and independent posts, creating a structure that could handle roof loads without depending entirely on the cabin's original construction. The redundant support would matter during heavy snow seasons, when roof loads could approach the limits of frontier carpentry. Rafter installation followed standard lean-to practice, with each timber cut to create the 4 to 12 pitch that would shed snow without requiring excessive lumber lengths. Herman calculated that steeper pitches would demand longer rafters and higher material costs, while shallower slopes might allow snow to accumulate and create dangerous loads. The compromise angle had been proven in countless barn and shed roofs throughout the timber country. The outer walls required both weather tightness and controlled ventilation, a combination that demanded careful planning. Herman skinned the structure with rough-sawn planks, fitting them tight enough to stop driving rain, but leaving strategic gaps near the eaves where damp air could escape. Trapped moisture was as dangerous as driven moisture. Wood that couldn't dry would rot regardless of how well it was protected from external weather. Inside the completed gallery, Herman organized his winter supplies according to both safety and efficiency. Split firewood went onto rails that held it 18 inches off the ground, sorted by species and size for easy selection during storm conditions. Birch and maple occupied the bays nearest the cabin doors, since these hardwoods provided the steady heat needed for overnight burns. Pine and hemlock, better for quick morning fires, filled the more distant sections where retrieval required less frequent trips. Hay storage presented its own challenges, since dried grass was both essential for livestock and catastrophically dangerous near any spark source. Herman built dedicated bays with stone-lined floors and metal-lined walls, positioning them downwind from the cabin's chimney and separated from the wood storage by stone partitions. The fire warden's concerns had been legitimate. Improper hay storage had burned down more than one homestead, but proper compartmentalization could manage the risks while preserving the benefits. Tool storage completed the gallery's organization, with hand tools hung on pegs where snow couldn't bury them, and larger implements secured in brackets that kept cutting edges away from daily traffic. Winter tool retrieval was often an emergency operation: broken stovepipes, damaged doors, structural repairs that couldn't wait for spring, and having equipment accessible in the worst weather could mean the difference between quick fixes and catastrophic failures. The The completed structure measured nearly 400 square feet of covered workspace, calculated from the 78-foot perimeter of Herman's cabin, multiplied by the 5-foot average depth of the gallery ring. Within this protected area, Herman could store 8 to 12 cords of split wood, enough fuel for the longest Great Lakes winter, plus hay, tools, and emergency supplies. The investment in lumber and labor had been substantial, but the capacity exceeded anything possible with conventional outdoor storage methods. By October of 1898, when the first serious cold arrived, Herman's neighbors could see the gallery's practical advantages, even if they remained skeptical of its economics. The covered workspace stayed dry during the autumn rains that turned outdoor work into misery. The organized storage made fuel selection and tool retrieval faster and more efficient than digging through snow-covered piles. The structure looked substantial and permanent, built to last decades rather than seasons. Bert Carlson still called it wasteful, but his criticism had lost some of its certainty. The gallery clearly worked as advertised: dry storage, wind protection, and organized access to winter supplies. Whether it worked well enough to justify its cost would depend on weather conditions that no homesteader could predict or control. Herman had built his solution for the worst possibilities, rather than the average expectations, betting that Great Lakes winters would eventually test everyone's preparations to their absolute limits. The weather began its turn toward mean in the first week of November 1913, when the barometric pressure started dropping and the wind shifted to blow straight off the open water of Lake Superior. Herman could feel the change in his bones before the thermometer confirmed it, that peculiar heaviness in the air that meant the lake was preparing to dump its stored moisture across the timber country, in whatever form the temperature would allow. The Ojibwe travelers who sometimes stopped at his place had their own words for this kind of weather, describing it as the time when the lake breathed ice and the forest held its breath. By November 7th, the signs had become unmistakable to anyone who'd lived through more than one Great Lakes winter. The wind carried a wet bite that cut through wool and leather with equal ease. Ice began forming along the shoreline, where waves crashed against the rocks, building daily into formations that would eventually extend hundreds of yards into the lake itself. The temperature dropped steadily, but not dramatically, from the mid-30s into the 20s, while the wind gained strength and consistency that suggested something much worse was building over the open water. Bert Carlson spent those warning days checking his fuel supply and reinforcing the tarps that covered his woodpile, confident that his time-tested methods would handle whatever November could deliver. His split oak and maple had seasoned through the summer and looked bone dry when he'd stacked it against his cabin wall in early October. The heavy canvas tarp he'd secured over the top had weathered 3 previous winters without failing, weighted down with field stones that had proven heavy enough to resist any wind the timber country had yet produced. Other homesteaders followed similar routines, making small adjustments to preparations that had served them adequately through past seasons. Mrs. Kowalski reinforced the lean-to roof that sheltered her modest woodpile, adding extra boards where previous storms had found weak spots. The fire warden made his rounds through the district, checking chimney clearances and reminding families about the dangers of overheated stovepipes when sustained cold forced people to burn more fuel than their heating systems had been designed to handle safely. Herman spent those same days checking the structural details that would matter when the storm arrived. He walked the perimeter of his gallery, testing the stability of posts that would soon carry not only the normal roof load, but whatever additional weight the wind might add through snow accumulation and pressure differentials. The planks that formed his outer walls had tightened through the summer's drying, creating better weather seals, but he checked the strategic vents near the eaves to ensure they remained open for moisture escape while staying small enough to prevent snow infiltration. The Great Lakes storm system that meteorologists would later document as one of the most severe on record began manifesting on November 9th with wind speeds that climbed steadily from 30 miles per hour to sustained velocities that exceeded 60 miles per hour across open water. The storm drew its power from the temperature differential between the still warm lake water and the Arctic air mass that was driving down from Canada, creating conditions that generated both hurricane-force winds and the kind of horizontal snow that turned visibility to zero within arm's length. By the afternoon of November 9th, the wind was driving snow with such force that it packed against the north-facing walls of buildings like wet concrete, building drifts that would eventually measure in feet rather than inches. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, but not so cold as to reduce the storm's moisture content. This combination of extreme wind, heavy snow, and moderate cold created the perfect conditions for destroying any fuel storage system that depended on external barriers to keep moisture away from seasoned wood. Bert Carlson discovered the vulnerability of conventional methods when he ventured outside to retrieve fuel for his evening fire. The tarp that had covered his woodpile now hung in frozen sheets, weighted down by snow that had turned to ice under the pressure of sustained wind. When he managed to pull back sections of the canvas, he found that wind-driven snow had penetrated every gap and crevice, coating his carefully seasoned splits with a glaze of ice thick enough to resist his heaviest maul. The wood that had rung like bells when he tested it in October now thudded dully when struck, waterlogged and frozen into masses that his stove couldn't ignite regardless of how many matches he applied. Similar failures occurred throughout the district as homesteaders discovered that tarps became funnels, lean-to roofs became collection points for driven snow, and exposed wood piles transformed into solid blocks of frozen timber that axes could barely separate. The conventional wisdom that had worked through average winters proved inadequate when faced with conditions that exceeded all previous experience. Families found themselves burning furniture and interior structural wood when their primary fuel supplies became unusable. Herman's gallery absorbed the full assault of the storm without compromising the resources it protected. The continuous shed roof forced wind to change direction and lose velocity before reaching the stored fuel, while the solid outer walls created a barrier that wind-driven snow couldn't penetrate. Inside the protected space, the temperature remained 10 to 20 degrees warmer than the outside air, not because of any heating system, but simply because the structure blocked the wind that would otherwise strip away any accumulated warmth. The fuel that Herman retrieved for his fires burned as cleanly during the storm's peak as it had during the calm days of autumn. Each piece of split birch and maple came from storage that had remained dry and accessible, requiring no special preparation or extended drying time before it could feed his stove effectively. While his neighbors struggled with frozen, waterlogged wood that produced more smoke than heat, Herman's fires burned hot and clean, maintaining cabin temperatures that allowed normal activities to continue throughout the storm's duration. The storm's persistence tested every aspect of winter preparation that homesteaders had made throughout the timber country. Families discovered whether their chimneys could handle sustained high-temperature burns, whether their stove systems could process marginal fuel effectively, and whether their cabin construction could resist the kind of wind loads that approached the limits of frontier building techniques. Those who had prepared for average conditions found themselves fighting for survival when the weather exceeded every assumption their experience had taught them to make. After 3 days of sustained hurricane-force winds and blinding snow, the storm system finally moved inland and began losing its connection to the moisture source that had fed its fury. The wind dropped gradually from destructive to merely uncomfortable, and visibility improved enough for people to assess the damage the weather had inflicted on their preparations and structures. Throughout the district, homesteaders emerged from cabins where they had burned everything combustible they could spare, facing the prospect of a long winter with fuel supplies that had proven inadequate when tested by conditions that exceeded all previous records. Herman's chimney had never stopped smoking throughout the storm's duration, visible proof that his heating system had continued functioning normally while others failed. His fuel supply had proven itself capable of sustaining clean, efficient burns regardless of external weather conditions. The gallery that his neighbors had mocked as wasteful and ugly had demonstrated its value in the most practical terms possible. When winter tried to kill the unprepared, proper preparation made the difference between survival and catastrophe. The first knock came at Herman's door on the evening of November 10th, not the neighborly tap of social visiting, but the urgent hammering of people who needed help and needed it immediately. Bert Carlson stood in the doorway with his youngest boy wrapped in blankets, both of them shivering despite the wool coats that should have been adequate for a short walk between cabins. Bert's stove had been struggling for hours, producing more smoke than heat as he fed it increasingly desperate combinations of frozen wood, furniture scraps, and anything else that might burn long enough to keep his family from freezing. Herman stepped aside without questions, gesturing them toward his own stove where clean-burning birch logs maintained the kind of steady heat that made indoor work possible without gloves. The contrast was immediate and measurable. Bert's cabin had been running perhaps 45 degrees inside while the wind drove the outdoor temperature to 10 below zero, but Herman's main room stayed comfortable enough for his wife Mina to continue her evening mending without needing to huddle directly against the firebox. Within an hour, Mrs. Kowalski arrived with her two children, having abandoned her own cabin when the lean-to roof that protected her woodpile collapsed under the combined weight of snow and wind pressure. Her fuel supply, adequate by normal standards, had become inaccessible beneath debris that she couldn't clear alone in storm conditions. The splits she'd managed to salvage before seeking shelter were coated with the same ice glaze that had made Bert's woodpile unusable, requiring extended drying time near an established fire before they could contribute meaningful heat. Herman's gallery made him the only neighbor who could provide immediate assistance without compromising his own family's survival. While others struggled to keep single stoves burning with marginal fuel, Herman could distribute dry splits from his protected storage without reducing his own supply below safe levels. The covered workspace allowed him to sort and prepare fuel even during the storm's peak intensity, selecting the specific wood types that would burn most efficiently in his neighbor's compromised heating systems. The refuge that Herman's cabin provided wasn't just about superior fuel storage. The gallery had also protected the structural integrity of his heating system in ways that became apparent only when compared to the failures others experienced. The continuous shed roof had prevented the kind of snow accumulation around his chimney base that caused draft problems in other cabins. The buffered envelope had reduced the wind load on his cabin walls, preventing the loosening of chinking and log joints that created drafts and smoke backdrafts in structures that took the full force of the storm. By the second night of the storm, 7 people had taken shelter in Herman's cabin, sleeping on floors and makeshift beds, while his stove continued burning cleanly through fuel that remained dry and accessible despite conditions that had made outdoor movement nearly impossible. The gallery's organization system proved its value repeatedly as Herman retrieved specific tools for emergency repairs, accessed stored hay for additional insulation, and maintained the steady fuel supply that kept everyone warm enough to sleep safely. The knowledge that informed Herman's success had sources deeper than individual innovation, a fact that became clear when old Antoine arrived on the storm's final day. The Ojibwe traveler had weathered the blizzard in a modified rock shelter several miles up the creek, using techniques that his people had developed over generations of surviving Great Lakes winters without access to European building materials or heating systems. Antoine's shelter had stayed warm through the same layered protection principles that Herman had applied to his gallery, an outer barrier that broke the wind, dead air spaces that held insulation, and careful positioning that used natural features for additional protection. Antoine examined Herman's gallery with the eye of someone who understood thermal management from necessity rather than theory. The continuous shed roof reminded him of the way his people built winter lodges with double coverings, an outer layer to shed water and snow, an inner layer to hold warm air, and strategic vents to prevent moisture accumulation that could freeze into ice dams. The organized storage system echoed the winter camps where every essential item had its designated place, protected from weather but accessible during emergencies when retrieval couldn't wait for improved conditions. The thermal principles that made Herman's gallery effective were identical to those that indigenous builders had been applying to cold climate construction for centuries before European contact. Modern building science would eventually describe these concepts as buffered envelopes and wind washing prevention, but Antoine's people had simply called it building to work with winter rather than fighting against it. The gallery succeeded because it addressed the same physics that governed all successful cold weather construction: stop the wind, control moisture, and create layers of protection that prevented heat loss through multiple failure modes. Herman's fuel storage capacity, calculated from the gallery's nearly 400 square feet of covered area, could accommodate 8 to 12 cords of split wood when organized efficiently. The perimeter measurement of 78 feet, multiplied by the 5-foot average depth of the storage ring, provided space that exceeded the capacity of any conventional outdoor woodpile while offering complete weather protection. During the storm, this surplus capacity had allowed Herman to share fuel generously without approaching the minimum reserves needed for his own family's survival through the remainder of winter. The mathematical reality of Herman's advantage became clear when neighbors calculated their own losses against his continued abundance. Bert Carlson estimated that half his woodpile had become unusable, either frozen into blocks that couldn't be split or contaminated with moisture that would require weeks of drying before effective burning became possible. Mrs. Kowalski had lost most of her supply when the lean-to collapsed, and what remained would need extensive preparation before it could heat her cabin adequately. Herman's losses were essentially zero, a few pieces of kindling damaged during retrieval, but no meaningful reduction in his capacity to heat his cabin through whatever remained of the winter season. The storm's aftermath revealed the broader implications of Herman's design philosophy, demonstrating how preparation for extreme conditions provided security during normal times as well. The neighbors who had mocked his wasteful construction now faced months of fuel shortage, dangerous heating conditions, and the prospect that their inadequate storage systems might fail again during any future weather that exceeded average expectations. Herman faced the same winter months with confidence that his heating needs were met regardless of what additional storms might develop over the Great Lakes. As families prepared to return to their own cabins once the immediate crisis had passed, the conversations had shifted from mockery to technical questions about post spacing, roof pitch, and ventilation requirements. The men who had called Herman's gallery a wasteful skirt now measured its dimensions with their eyes, calculating what similar construction might cost in materials and labor. The women who had dismissed the project as foreign foolishness now asked Mina about the organizational systems that kept tools accessible and fuel sorted by type and burning characteristics. The storm had provided the kind of field test that proved or disproved frontier construction methods without regard for conventional wisdom or community opinion. Herman's gallery had passed that test decisively, demonstrating that proper preparation for extreme conditions provided security and comfort during normal times while offering critical advantages when survival depended on systems, working exactly as designed under the worst possible circumstances. Spring thaw came late to Baraga County in 1914, with snow lingering into April and mud season extending well into May before the timber trails became passable for regular visiting. When neighbors finally began making social calls again, the conversations carried a different tone than those of the previous autumn. The men who had mocked Herman's gallery as wasteful construction now asked practical questions about lumber requirements and foundation techniques. They didn't say Herman had been right. That kind of direct admission violated the unspoken codes of frontier pride. But they wanted to understand how a man framed corner posts to carry roof loads and shed rain for decades rather than seasons. Bert Carlson was among the first to make the transition from critic to student, arriving at Herman's place in early June with a notebook and measuring tape that suggested serious intentions. He'd spent the winter months burning furniture and interior trim to supplement his damaged fuel supply, experiences that had taught him the difference between adequate preparation and reliable preparation. Bert's questions focused on the structural details that would matter during construction: how deep to dig post holes in timber country soil, whether to use mortise and tenon joints or rely on metal hardware for connecting rafters to plates, and how to calculate lumber quantities for a project that would require substantial upfront investment. Herman walked Bert through the gallery's construction sequence with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge shared was knowledge preserved. The post spacing of 8 feet had been determined by standard lumber lengths and roof load requirements, creating bays large enough for organized storage while maintaining structural integrity under snow loads that could reach substantial weights during heavy winters. The 4 to 12 roof pitch provided adequate drainage without requiring excessive rafter lengths, a compromise that balanced material costs against functional performance in a climate where both rain and snow needed to be shed effectively. The ledger board system that connected the gallery roof to the existing cabin walls required careful measurement and sharp tools, Herman explained, since any gaps would create leaks that could damage both stored materials and the structural wood itself. He'd chosen to support each ledger with both wall attachments and independent posts, creating redundant load paths that could handle roof weights even if the original cabin log settled or shifted over time. This belt and suspenders approach had proven wise during the November storm, when wind loads had tested every connection to its design limits. Mrs. Kowalski's reconstruction efforts followed Herman's example more closely than any other neighbors, though her smaller cabin and limited resources required modifications to fit her specific circumstances. She built a three-sided gallery that protected her fuel storage on the north, west, and south exposures, while leaving the east wall open for cost savings and ease of access. Her storage capacity was reduced compared to Herman's full wraparound design, but the covered area still provided weather protection for 4 cords of split wood, plus organized space for tools and emergency supplies. The fire warden, who had initially worried about Herman's combustible storage arrangements, became an unexpected advocate for similar construction throughout his district, having observed how the gallery's organization and fire-breaking features had actually reduced risks compared to conventional outdoor piles. The stone partitions that separated hay storage from wood storage, the metal-lined walls around the most dangerous materials, and the controlled ventilation that prevented moisture accumulation had all contributed to safer fuel management than the tarps and lean-tos that most homesteaders relied upon. By autumn of 1914, 3 other homesteads in the immediate area had added gallery-style fuel storage to their preparations, each adapted to local conditions and family resources, but all following the basic principles Herman had demonstrated. The structures varied in size and complexity. Some covered only 2 walls of the main cabin, others used different roofing materials or post spacing, but all incorporated the wind-breaking and moisture control features that had proven essential during the previous winter's emergency. The knowledge that Herman had applied to his gallery construction drew from sources that extended far beyond individual innovation, a heritage that became clearer as neighbors learned to see thermal management as a systematic discipline rather than a collection of isolated tricks. Indigenous builders throughout the Great Lakes region had been applying similar layered protection principles for generations, creating winter shelters that used natural materials and careful positioning to achieve thermal control without access to manufactured heating systems or imported building materials. The documentation that survived from Herman's homestead years, preserved through the efforts of historical societies and descendant families, provided evidence that immigrant knowledge and indigenous wisdom often converged on identical solutions to cold climate survival problems. The double wall insulation systems that Scandinavian builders brought from Northern Europe shared essential features with the layered lodge construction that Ojibwe and other tribal nations had developed independently, both recognizing that dead air spaces and wind barriers were fundamental to creating livable interior conditions during extended cold periods. Herman's success with the gallery design reflected this convergence of practical traditions, though he had applied the principles using materials and techniques available to a Great Lakes homesteader, rather than the specialized resources of either European or indigenous building systems. His innovation lay not in discovering new physics, but in adapting proven thermal management concepts to the specific challenges of heating a log cabin with wood fuel in a climate where fuel storage was as critical as structural integrity. The broader historical context that gave meaning to Herman's individual success included the reality that frontier communities regularly faced winter conditions that tested every aspect of their preparation and construction. The Great Lakes storm of November 1913 had been exceptional in its severity, but every winter brought weather that could kill the unprepared or inadequately housed. Homesteaders who survived multiple decades in the timber country learned to build for the worst possibilities rather than average expectations, understanding that the difference between adequate and excellent preparation often determined whether families lived or died. Modern building science would eventually validate the thermal principles that Herman had applied through practical experience and inherited knowledge, describing his gallery as an effective example of buffered envelope construction and wind washing prevention. The continuous shed roof that forced wind to change direction, the controlled ventilation that prevented moisture accumulation, and the organized storage that kept fuel dry and accessible all represented applications of heat transfer physics that professional engineers would later quantify and systematize. Herman Hunke died in 1916, 3 years after the storm that had vindicated his construction methods, and 2 decades after homesteading the Baraga County timber claim, where he had built his innovative fuel storage system. His cabin and gallery survived him, eventually becoming part of the preserved homestead that would educate future generations about the practical wisdom that had enabled immigrant families to thrive in one of the continent's most challenging climates. The structures he built demonstrated that the best insulation was always the kind that also kept firewood dry, a lesson learned through necessity and proven through the winters that had tried to kill everyone who wasn't prepared to meet them on equal terms.